Shalom Aleichem Rabbi Sai. This is Yehud 11. The program is 11 at 11, heard each and every Thursday evening at the 11 o'clock to midnight hour. I'm your humble host, Yehuda Halevi Levin, with 98% of my brain and my hashkafa. The hashkafa of Gedolei Yisrael of yesteryear, tied behind the backs of Agudas Yisrael, Flatbush, Lubavitch, Queens, Monsey, Williamsburg, Borough Park, Lubavitch, Satmar, Asskanim, all just to make this simple hashkafa understandable. Just that we can understand that in the 1950s and even into the early 60s, the Gentile women who were still having 6, 7, 8 babies and going to church on Sundays, lahavdil, were dressed more tzniustik than many of the Haredi women today. If you can understand that, you understand what I mean by the hashkafas of Gedolei Yisrael of yesterday. And so this is a program that I promoted last week. I said that it's important, pardon me, that we start to take a look back in history for the last 50, 60 years to see how what we call the theory of immorality evolution, I'm coining a new phrase. In other words, how, when Rudy Giuliani was mayor, so what happened was he had, after the Dinkins years, which featured prominently the Crown Heights riots, and which tzaddik it was it Cuomo, Mario, who said, let them vent, that it took 3 days to get things under control. This was all happening because the crime was going crazy under Dinkins, and then Giuliani, a law and order person, came in, and what he did was, I forget the exact term he used, but he said that the quality of life crimes like graffiti or the squeegee men who would come to you at Canal Street at a stoplight and wash your windshields with dirty water and then demand money from you, he would have these people arrested. And because you stopped the little holes in society, the little crimes, it prevented greater crimes. So tonight, I want to try to document to you with my guest, my very special guest, what was going on for the last 60, 50 years societally, with social mores changing rapidly, and where were the Jewish Asskanim, Rabbanim, organizations, etc. And let's try to figure out when things really started to go bad and what people should have done. And we're going to try to bring that up to and including today, when at this late stage in the devolving culture, we still have all the fruma politicians, as recently as the last few months, voting for terrible things that are anathema, that are antithetical to the very basic standards and values. And once again, I say, not only the ladies from the 1950s or 60s who were religious Gentiles would be appalled, but religious Gentiles ad hayoim hazeh ve'ad bichlal, they would be they are outraged at what Orthodox Jews are being mechalel Hashem Shemayim, by voting for. So without any further ado, I want to present my guest this evening. We'll call him Poloni. We're going to have him anonymous. He's a gentleman who has spent at least the last approximately 8 to 10 years starting and being very involved in this in observing the moral decline and trying to do as much as he possibly could. In the Bechin of Neutel Schar Keneged Kulam, was one of the handful of people who have been doing things, and he has a lot to tell us, to instruct us, to inform us. So without any further ado, Poloni, thank you very much for coming on to our program. Now, I just want to, before this, I'll mention this once or twice throughout the evening. I don't know halachically when a person becomes called a Baal Simcha, meaning there are svarim that say, Hasidic svarim that say, that from the Shabbos Oifruf, the mechila that a chassan gets, that we learn out from Machlas, that a chassan, and by extension a kala, receives mechilas avonos when they get married. When does that occur? So there are svarim that say, Hasidic svarim that say, that it comes in gradually, starting with the Shabbos of the Oifruf. So the question is, when is a parent of a chassan or kala called a Bal Simcha? If he's within the week of striking distance, is he a Bal Simcha? Is he a Bal Simcha in waiting? So I just want to announce to the Olam, Ma'oshev LaHashem Kol Tag Meloy Alai, Kois Yeshuas Eso V'Shem Hashem Ekro, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, on Yom Hashishi, on this Friday at 11 o'clock, will be the Kabbalah's Panim, followed by 12 o'clock the Chuppah. That's right, you heard right, on Friday morning, Friday at noon, my daughter, Miri Levin, is getting married, Yirtzeh Hashem B'Shatov Mitzlachas, to Yankee Weber. It's going to be like the old days where they used to do this in Europe for over 1,000 years. There's a famous story with one of the chassanis that the Ramah was involved in, and there was a big discussion in Poskim about that. It went into Shabbos, there was musicians, or whatever the situation was. We're not going to spend any time on this, but this is also done to a certain extent in Eretz Yisrael. And I want to just tell the Olam that, of course, there's not going to be a sit-down Suda, but there's going to be an ongoing smorgasbord. So therefore, with Rishus of the Chassan Kala, I want to invite whoever in Klal Yisrael wants to see something that's now an anomaly, but it used to happen quite frequently. They want to join with us in the Simcha. This will take place at the Diker Heights Golf Course or Golf Club, which is in Bay Ridge, 86th Street and 7th Avenue. 86th Street and 7th Avenue. I think that's the address. It's the Diker Heights Golf Course. So the Olam was invited to be there and be Mesameach. Now, Poloni, we have had many discussions and worked together for a significant number of years already, and you're a font of information. And I wanted to ask you to take us back in the time capsule. Let's go back to the late 1950s. In the late 1950s, Hollywood was still self-censoring their movies. Their movies were what by contemporary standards we would call very clean. They were very careful in what they put in. As a matter of fact, in the early 60s in television, they wouldn't even show episode when Elvis Presley was on the Ed Sullivan program. They wouldn't show his gyrations. They would only show from the chest up because it was considered to be too lewd. And the same thing, people had to sleep in separate beds with pajamas on, with covers over them, etc., etc. Those days are long gone. But what can you tell us about the first cracks in morality, legislatively or movement-wise? Let's not take it back any further, but to the late 1950s.
There were a few in the early 1900s. At the birth of movies, the Supreme Court made a ruling that movies were not considered to be primarily speech; they were business, so they could be. The government had refused to censor movies. And there were censorizations for different reasons. Some which might be political views, which I'm not sure was right, and also for basic obscenity and things that obviously everyone should be against. Those started to chip away in the 50s. There also was a Supreme Court case that decades earlier that already lessened the rules of obscenity when Ulysses went to trial. So there was a few signs. But the real modern movement started, there were a few cases in the 50s that were chipping, but they wanted to be a very good Torah Jew and already uphold the standards and agree with them because it wasn't exactly it was more opinion-based things as opposed to basic znus. But those things led the stage for what happened later. In the 57, there was a Supreme Court case which already started to make tests of what's considered that the Constitution held that things that are obscene are not covered in the First Amendment, which means the government has rishos to ban them. However, the language of the decision left room up for things, and how they defined what's obscene was not exactly standards that were acceptable to most. Basically, it has to be pure out and out pornography to be considered obscene, at least by the end of these. So the case was won in 57. It's called Roth versus the United States, but they could only really ban stuff that were utterly without redeeming social importance. And throughout the years, this got worse and worse. So basically, in the original, for a while, they would do an entire pornographic movie, from what I was told. They didn't cheat them, obviously, but and they would put in one scene that just has just to be Yotzei, get some comedy or something, make some social statement, just to be Yotzei that the ruling to get some value, so they couldn't censor it. And there were so this already started the process tripping, and for a while, the Supreme Court, for a period of about 10 years, was literally looking at pornography to see if it met the test for many, many cases. And that already started in 57, and just to repeat that, the court rules that something that's obscene is you're allowed to ban, but things later it developed the language. If it's considered just indecent, you're not allowed to ban it. It's forbidden to ban according to the Constitution for any locality. So this already started the process, along with other things developing that allowed.
Let me ask you this. Let me ask you a very simple question. A person who is reading, say, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Law Review, or was a student in law school or anything else, was this plainly a big secret, or did anybody who had a shaykhus with the secular culture in the Orthodox Jewish community, people who would read the newspapers every day, he listened to the news, etc., would they know that this was occurring?
Hard to say. Don't know. Can't. I don't. Just doing a quick search of New York Times right now, I'm having trouble finding this case mentioned with the title.
Okay, let's move on because the time flies.
I do have it mentioned. I don't really see this. But the thing that gets more interesting and more related to other issues, the next year in 58, there was another decision on what's considered obscene. So that is One Incorporated versus Ullison. And this is probably the most important. The word if Stonewall was the birth of the gay rights movement, this will be the hurrah of the gay rights movement, and this could arguably be the worst Supreme Court decision ever because of what it led to. So the court case decided. Basically, there was gay rights movements or gay rights groups in the 50s, and they had their secret magazines and stuff. But the court decided that pro-homosexual writing, by definition, is not obscene. So they could not be censored. by doing this, it now gave them it now was able to turn what's localized movements in San Francisco and different cells, somewhat inspired by communist cells, just side point, that they're now able to become national, and they're able to organize and picket and do all sort, get very far in passing in their whole agenda. So the court decided that anything that's for homosexual writing is not, just by its definition, obscene.
Okay, now we've got to move along a little because we got to get into juice. Then there was a decision, or there was a legislative move in 1962 in Illinois. Can you tell us
In 1962, the legislature, the state legislature in the first state, legalized homosexual sodomy, to put it simply. Until then, every state, it was a crime to homosexual behavior, at least males. And by Illinois, they did this with they did this with more of a libertarianist argument that everyone has the right to do what they want and things like that. And this started this was the first state to decriminalize it, and next state to do so was 1971. You had a few states that started the process, but the seeds were already set. It wasn't that people woke. So if someone was following the legislature or the courts, somebody would have been aware. So I'm not sure if the average informed person would have known. But if you would have lobbyists or Supreme Court lawyers they probably would have known what was going on.
So I just want to give you an example. I'm not asking you to come per se, but we have a gentleman, Nat Lewin. I don't know, he might very well be in his 80s now, or late 70s. So the idea that in the 1960s and in the late 50s, that there was not Orthodox Jewish people who were themselves lawyers, law professors or teachers or whatever, that nobody knew and nobody saw. And if Frank Sinatra in the 1950s, who was a crooner, a singer, but he looked at rock and roll and spoke out like did many, many, many people spoke out against rock and roll in the 50s. Forget about in the 60s when the Beatles came in the earliest 60s, 62, 63, I mean, and Commandovid. So to say that people did not know and did not understand the attitude, I'm saying, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I'm saying that the attitude of quasi-malfeasance in not knowing that where this is going to lead, when we have a Yiddishism, which is thousands of years old, that the Chinuch said a person is influenced by society and by what happens in the environment. And if we see the Gentiles are going a certain way, then to me, it's obvious. This was like the Rudy Giuliani with the squeegee things.
The Sefer Hasidim says it's stronger than what you said. The Sefer Hasidim says in the Middle Ages, when they hated us, the best of the Jews are affected by the non-Jews around them. So if that's for the Middle Ages, Kal v'chomer when we're stuck in between them and we semi-admire them and we're interrelated. The Middle Ages, we were more segregated from the brain.
Okay, we got it. Listen, we have to keep it short. I want to move because we've got a lot of ground to cover.
You asked about Nat Lewin. In 1969, there was a Supreme Court case, Byrne versus Karaletz, something like this, where though it was derech agav in the case to some extent because there were other factors besides the pornography itself, but he was defending a movie that was showing what we would call pornographic scenes in a mainstream movie. He was defending the movie to their owner. So I'm sure he must have had some reading up of this at least by 1969.
Okay, was there anything else before we get to the 70s? Was there anything else? Of course, there was Stonewall in 69. Was there anything else in the 1960s that you want to point out briefly, having to do with pornography, mishkav zacha, abortion, adultery, anything on the moral issues that you'd want to point out before we get to the 70s?
Not so much, because the 70s are really where the stuff gets.
Okay, so let's go in rapid succession.
So, in 1970, there was the most important decision, the most important vote, at least for a birth, that was in New York State. The New York State legislature passed abortion by one vote in the assembly.
In the year 1970.
Yeah, and to top this all off, in 1969 they passed it. They did not have the votes to pass it. It was a very controversial, even amongst groups like the ACLU in the late 60s, abortion, because is this freedom? Is this privacy? They're originally coming from a privacy perspective before they totally got into
okay, well, all right, we don't have to get into it too deeply.
So at that time, you have the assembly member from Borough Park in 69 voted against it. His name was Leonard Silverman.
Yeah, remember.
The next year, right before when it passed, not when it passed in 70, they voted. It failed by a few votes. So when this failed, at that time already, Leonard Silverman was one of the people who switched his votes from a no to a yes. So it still failed, but he already switched from voting against it to voting for it. So then what happened is then a week or so later, they were able to pass this right before Pesach, where they got it was 74-74, and you need 76 votes to pass it. And the custom at the time was that the speaker didn't vote unless they had the votes. So one member named George Michael, or Mitchell, to get the exact name out right this second, so switched his vote from a no to a yes on the floor, and saying how he knows he's going to lose his seat to George Michaels. So, and he did lose his seat. And one of the reasons is, though there are different versions of the story, but if you trace it back to the original, it was because he was afraid to go home to the Seder and get insulted by his Jewish family members that he didn't vote for, that he's the reason abortion failed. And then once that happened, he switched. They got 75 votes, and the speaker was 76, so it goes on to pass by one vote. From Aaron Soloveitchik on this whole thing, I'm reading what he said here. Why did it not any of the rabbis in New York reassure him that his first thoughts had been right? We must stay here. Hashanah mikol am, Hashanah mikol dor.
There you have it. My rabbi say, if Aaron Soloveitchik could say this, and here we already had in the 1960s, we had people, Choshev Asskanim, that visited President Kennedy in the White House. This is 7 or 8 years after the Kennedy assassination. To say that they didn't know, that it wasn't important, to say they didn't know, where was the Jewish community when Silverman at Borough Park was voting the wrong way? And I told a story that I heard. I even had the names of the people. There was one person from the Young Israel movement. There were 3 people. They went and they were lobbying, and they were told that the representative of Williamsburg was voting the wrong way because he was told by the Rosh Kahal that we don't have abortions, we don't care, just keep the money coming, basically. This is not our issue.
Yeah.
Okay, moving along, what's the next step?
Well, there's more to this.
Yeah, but remember, the clock is ticking. We're 25 minutes.
So at that time, you have a statement soon after the law passed in the New York Times in July of that year, past April, where you got the RCA condemning the law and the OU. The Aguda at this time did not condemn the law. So they weren't on record at this time condemning the law, and they did a little bit in the Jewish Observer, but Aguda has had statements. By the 70s, you already see Aguda pinning statements into New York Times. But it's worse. In 1972, when Silverman was up for re-election, you could go and look in the Jewish Observer. You go find the election issue from 72. And you could see there was this big advertisement in the Jewish Observer telling everybody to go vote for him.
So I want to say this clearly. For those who've been following this program faithfully, there were several times, several different programs, where I coined a phrase and documented it. I called it the errant Rabbi Shera Zichroinu Levaracha philosophy on moral issues. And I buttressed my contentions by taking out the book, the authenticated, authorized, airbrushed biography of Rabbi Shera from Art Scroll. Who wrote it? I forget, Yonis and Rosenblum or whoever wrote it. And there are direct quotes from Rabbi Shera, direct quotes from Solaz, who I ran against in 84, and Schumer, saying basically that Rabbi Shera's philosophy was that we agreed to disagree on the social issues, and that was the problem. And I maintain that this wasn't the position of Gedolei Yisrael. This was a case, we put our fingers where the Asskanim were using their own thoughts, but the point is that the Asskanim were not informing Gedolei Yisrael about what was going on. And this is already approximately 13, 14 years in, and the problems continue to get worse. What would you...
It's a little worse because in the official book, it says, this is talking about 1989, until that point, we're talking about when Reform got involved, made a statement that Judaism supports abortion. Agudas Israel had never taken a high-profile, public profile in the abortion debates. That's quoted from the book. So the book itself says that they didn't do this. Meanwhile, we have the RCA and the OU taking stronger stance than Aguda on this issue. And you could see that if you want to time that the Molesta said differently, you could see the tshuva for Moshe. He didn't hold this way. Not to mention certain masters telling Paul Bookson what to do, which is another point. Why couldn't Aguda speak to Paul Bookson?
Absolutely, and I told the Maisa because the Maisa happened with my friend Michael Bubro, who went into Rav Moshe, and with Rabbi Rivlin, the secretary, translating for him. And on the spot, Rav Moshe picked up the phone to call Paul Bookson and demand that he change his vote. That he had already voted, I think, pro-abortion in the state senate, or whatever. But the point is here that it's clearly established. Rav Moshe wrote in the Am HaTorah, a tshuva published in the Am HaTorah of Agudas Yisrael, in which he took a super hardcore position that he held that the shirish of the Isser of abortion is leisirzach, that it's akin to murder. It's a subsumed, it's under the bulwark, under the umbrella of murder, which is a very strong position. And Moshe had big disputes with the Tzitz Eliezer on different aspects of abortion. So it's inconceivable that Rav Moshe would, if he would have been aware of exactly details, and when he was aware, that he wouldn't have had Agudas Yisrael speak out. Now, eventually, the Mayetzes did come out with some sort of a milk toast because they were so concerned about maybe it would come out that the strong pro-life view would be the Catholic view from the moment of conception. So therefore, the statement that was crafted, it wasn't crafted by Rav Moshe, it wasn't crafted by Rav Yaakov. Rav Yaakov was one of the first things he was something when he moved to Muncie. He was anti-abortion. I forget the exact Misa. One of the first things is he indicated how anti-abortion he was. This was like a Swiss cheese. It was full of holes, the statement. And later on, years later, they revamped it. But it was all posturing. Nobody looked at the Aguda statements, and the politicians understood. Chuck Schumer told me when I went to testify against the law that was trying to make, I forget what it was called, but they were trying to make RICO statutes out of people who blocked abortion clinics. And I was testifying against this. Schumer was upset with me, and he said, I'm friends with Rabbi Morris Sheriff for years, and he never told me anything that the Orthodox Jewish community is concerned about abortion. Okay, here's the smoking gun.
Just more, if someone would say that Aguda didn't have the power by the 70s, but by 75 there was a bill to put a brain death standard, or what's considered death in New York, and the bill failed by a few votes. And people were quoting Agudas Yisrael on the legislative floor as the reason for their vote. So many the votes. So Aguda clearly had enough influence to influence politicians much more diverse 5 years later. That there had a vote on that issue. So you see that they were a lot more powerful than people might think.
Meanwhile, do you have any information on what Aguda did? And I know they didn't do much, if anything, on an issue that was very big in the 1970s and that is reemerging now, called the Equal Rights Amendment, the push to constitutionally give equal rights to women, which would have profound impacts on drafting women in the army, on abortion, on mishkav zachar, etc.
Not really. I know that it passed Congress with flying colors. The only congressman who represented the Jewish communities who got elected, who voted against it was Manny Seller, who was there since the 20s, and he lost his primary because of it. I'm not sure where Aguda stood in that primary, but that's definitely something the historians will be very good to know if they supported him or Liz Holtzman. But
at the same time,
state fights that happened throughout. I know they say Neuberger was very good from Ner Yisrael, but I'm not sure in practice. Almost every state the Jewish community was in passed it, and except Illinois, where there was a big fight, and they only just passed that recently. And when they passed it recently, there was not a word from Aguda. When they just passed this a few last year, 2 years ago.
I'm jumping out of order, but you did inform me that Mamish this week or very recently in Maryland, they voted on the similar bill to what Kalish voted on in Illinois. Kalish
not exactly. It wasn't a vote. It was a letter with a bunch of legislators to the state education department.
Go ahead.
Urging them to throw LGBT lessons into the history courses. And you have Senator Jill Carter, who represents Park Heights, who was just recently endorsed in the last election by Shepard Neuberger, that she was one of the people who signed this letter.
And there have been several people who he supported in Maryland who have voted for all kinds of schmutz, including homosexual marriage, etc.
And it's just a suicide.
and assisted suicide, which, yeah.
The thing that I'd like to just discuss, the marriage in New York, is that says the most. So there's when the marriage was coming, a lot of the people who they called the fanatics and the Kanoim were making a very big stink in 2010 election. And if we remember that Aguda was doing everything they can to support Como, they went totally against Palladino. And then in the 2011 legislature, they were pushing a little bit with phone calls, but not too much. So when that happened, there was so Shmuel Lefkowitz and wrote in the Religion Dispatches, which was this quote. This is what they said. Lefkowitz believes that same-sex marriage lacks the requisite momentum for passage. If I believe the votes were there, I put more effort into it. I believe this is under control. This is coming about. This article came out on June 14th, 2011. On June 14th, 2011, on Vasisnayas, New York, it goes into overdrive to stop New York's same-sex marriage legalization.
Yeah. What did they do exactly? They had one trip, if I recall correctly, one mission to Albany. I don't even know if it was totally on the issue of homosexual marriage, or that was one of their issues, because year after year, when you would look at the mission statements for those trips, it would be gelt and gelt and gelt and gelt, and if morality was there, it was very, very low on the totem pole. And in this particular thing, around the time of marriage, they were busy posing, smiling for pictures with the same Nevolim legislators who were going to vote against this stuff.
So just let me say, so what you noticed, it was the same day the articles came out. Now, around the same time, they were able to switch over 3 Democrats, so shortly after that article came out, within a few days, I called up Lefkowitz, and I spoke to him, and I asked him a question. I said, did you say this? And he told me, yes, he said that. I asked him, do you still believe this? Because the political situation was obviously changed at that point. He said, no. He now thinks, and I asked him, do you think it's going to pass now? He said, yes, there's not much we could do, but we're still fighting it strong. So I said, maybe we should, because the situation's so desperate, you should ally together with all the people, with us, who've been screaming about this and saying this is likely to pass. So he said, no, because we're not doing this the right way. We're not professional. So we were calling this right, and he believes that we were calling. He's on record quoted that this is getting this wrong, and then he says that he doesn't want to work with people who are calling it right because they're not fighting it properly. They're not doing things right.
So it
gets worse. We have to just look. Give me a second.
Yeah, sure.
Then Motzei Shabbos, before the marriage passed, there was Zev Brunner had a radio show where he's talking about the proper position, whether we should fight this issue or not. And one of the people on the show says that Agudas Yisrael met with Como to fight it that week. This is 2 weeks before it passed. So later I happened to see his wife out, and I asked him a question. I asked him, how you guys could have stopped the marriage. Why didn't you do anything? So he said, we did. So I asked him, what did you do? So he gave me one of the things he did. The first thing he gave me was we had a big meeting with Como to stop the marriage. So I asked him the obvious question. Cuomo staked his entire political career on fighting to get this so-called marriage. How could you? What are you going to tell Cuomo? You're going to speak to him. There are a lot of swing voters. Why you could go speak to a bunch of legislators? Go speak to Helene Weinstein. What are you speaking to Cuomo for? That's already go use pressure on. Go speak to Rhoda Jacobs, who is probably against this. What are they going to speak to Cuomo, the Rosh Hashanah? So he told me the reason they were speaking to Cuomo was because if the bill would pass, they would need to have religious exemptions in. And then, when the bill came up for the floor, Stephen Salant said he was only voting for this bill because there are now acceptable religious exemptions in the bill. So Agudas Haskama on the religious exemptions helped get one of the two necessary votes and probably 4 votes of the Republicans to help pass this bill.
This is shocking, but this follows the pattern of malfeasance and the hashkafa that I have been propagating for some time now, that the meaning of machrivayich umeharsayich mimech yetzeu means that it's what we do, the miuta of Klal Yisrael, the Perushim, the Orthodox, the Haredim. Time and time again this evening, we've seen case after case where through sins of commission, of actively doing the wrong thing, of omission, by turning the other cheek, ignoring, machen sich nicht wissentlich, acting like ostriches, we are directly responsible. It's a double tumur. I've said this before on the program. When they came to Rav Moshe once and they told him the Gewalt outside, a boy was on a bicycle and he got hit by a car and he has a yarmulke, the Rosh Hashiva should pray for his life. The Rosh Hashiva said he is not a Yiddish kind. So they asked him, they found out later on he was a Gentile who had grabbed the yarmulke off of a child and he had sped away on his bike and he got hit by a car. They asked Rav Moshe, how did you know? It's Ruach HaKodesh. He said, it can't be that on the same block where I'm putting in so much koiches for Klal Yisrael and my Torah and everything else that I do, on that block Hashem should visit Peronius. This is by extension the concept that I'm trying to say. In New York, the Ir B'Aim, the Yerushalayim of the whole world outside of Yerushalayim of Eretz Yisrael, it can't be with all our Torah, Avodah Gemilas Chasadim, that if we were concerned, then we would try, that we shouldn't be able to slow things down. And the raya is, as I've said often on this program, that the day that they made the first homosexual marriages, it was the last Sunday in July, a month after they passed the bill in Albany. The Gentiles were marching and they asked me to be there with them. And a leader, Andrew Hum, you can Google him, an Oisvav leader of the Mishkevei Zocha, came over to me and said, you and a handful of people held us up for 10 or 15 years. I forget what nusach he used. It was either 10 or 15. And the answer is, the explanation is, how did I had no money, I had no organization, I didn't have a letterhead, I didn't have enough money to pay $10 for a taxi many times to go to the press conferences I held on the steps of City Hall. And the answer is, because when one Yid does what the Gedolim of yesteryear tell him and you do it, it has a profound effect. And imagine we had a handful of people like the gentleman who's on the phone with me. And who knows how much, we'll find out in the Olam Emes what we accomplished and how we stole things off. But this is malfeasance again and again. Now, let's move towards the 801A situation.
Can I just give
sure.
a New Jersey bullying bill first?
Yeah, please.
This leads right into 801A.
Please, go ahead.
So what happened, there was a bullying bill in New Jersey. This is coming after 801A passed in New York. And the bill, this bill would put a whole entire system to stop bullying with, of course, bullying is only a problem when it's against certain groups. But a lot of these bullying laws, when you actually read them, it doesn't say you can't bully. It says you can't bully people based on this. It doesn't. So if it's not for one of those characteristics, it's not always against the law to bully.
Let me make that clear. People might not understand. In other words, it says you're not allowed to bully people based on their perceived or identity or gender or orientation, etc., etc. But it's not a law you can't bully people because they're fat or because they're too skinny or because they're too nebby or they're dwarks or whatever it is. So first of all, the whole bill is for certain types of people, basically.
The weight's in some of these bills, not so much the height. Certainly not the nebby and cheap or anything like that. It's not in there.
Right.
But so this bill, included in the bill, was also two education clauses, including a respect week, which you had to teach respect based on the not to bully based on the characteristics before, which would include the list of agenda. So in short, this is a fancy legalese way of getting gays in without anyone who reads the bill who doesn't know how to read bills carefully noticing. So what happened was I had a conversation on the day of the vote with Good the lobbyist at the time. Good the lobbyist told me that I told him he has to vote against it. So he said to me that he can't because they exempted yeshivas because somehow he said they put into exempt yeshivas from the bill, so he can't fight it. So I'm still not so sure he didn't make that story up, and the original bill ever had it, but we'll take it as his word. I took him at his word for it. That there was a proposal, because the original bill never had the idea to exempt. It was always only public schools, but if he says there was a move to apply it to yeshivas, it's theoretically possible. Like they've done it, and they did it before, but I don't believe it necessarily. So I told him, okay, but who says that you still can't fight it? You still should be mechoyev to fight it. We can't have it by the public schools either. So he told me that the Moetzes decided differently. So I told him I happen to know one of the chiefs of the Moetzes members, and he told me himself he has to fight this because I already had a conversation once on someone on the New York bill. It's the same concept. So he told me he knows because Shmuel Kamenetsky called him up the night before and told him to go and fight the bill, but the rest of the Moetzes decided differently. I said, how did he know? Did you speak to the Moetzes members? No, because that was what he was told by his superiors in New York. So obviously it had to come through the Moetzes. So I said, okay, but at least you should know. You should tell them you're not opposing the bill because of the issue, but you still don't support them. Don't give anyone the impression that this bill's acceptable because it's against yeshivas. Just that you're compromising and not fighting it because it exempts yeshivas. No one should have a idea that you would support the bill. So he reassured me that no one would ever think such a thing. So I told him, I don't believe you, but then later that day, I tell Gary Sher that he should vote against this bill. Gary Sher tells me, quote, something along the lines of, there's nothing wrong with this bill. Yisrael did not object to this bill. So I told him I could go get you why you Rosh Yeshiva because I know where he stands. And that would say you should oppose this bill. And he eventually abstained. And most of the people abstained. I think one person voted against this, but there were a lot of people could have. If there would have been a tumult by Aguda, I'm sure they could have stopped a few votes and would have made and potentially the tumult they would have made might have been enough to force Christie to veto it. Who got a phone calls, and Aguda didn't even make phone calls to Christie, at least that I know of, and there were certain petitions that a certain very prominent rabbi in Lakewood refused to get involved in the most prominent rabbis in Lakewood in the eyes of the people. But specifically, they did not make a big scene over this, and Christie signed the bill into law. But if there would have been a big tumult over the fact that it would require gay teaching, I'm sure Christie would have vetoed it just for political pressure alone.
So I want to stop it for a moment here. In the final moments of my program last week, and we're now getting into the last 10 minutes of this program, I showed an unholy tripartite connection between the malfeasance of the rabbinic community in Get Meusa. Okay, I'm not asking you to comment on this. This is not our topic tonight, but I explained that we have tremendous problems with the feminization of the process and the Get Meusas, which really means that there might be a lot of mamzerus going on in Klal Yisrael. I drew a parallel between that and Eretz Yisrael, what's going on right now, where some of the most prominent Rabbanim and Rosh Yeshivas are ostrich-like. Oh, our Ponevezh, our Mir, our this yeshiva, our that big yeshiva are not being directly impacted yet by the people who are pushing the drafting of yeshiva bachrim. There are now thousands that have been drafted, Haredim. So if it's happening in the smaller Sephardic yeshivas, or they're picking off these yechidim, so it's not our business. So this concept, this treif garbage, that the Gemara says, "My samchus d'damech tfei," who says your blood is redder? The Gemara says if they tell you kill somebody, you'll be killed. So the Gemara says you're not allowed to do it. You have to let yourself be killed because my samchus, who says your blood is redder? Who are you to make these decisions? This idea that we jettison, that we throw under the bus anybody who's in the goyish, the secular, rather, public school system, when there are thousands of Jews in New Jersey who go to public school, so they're allowed to be brainwashed for arayos. And we even have the anomaly now that because of the tuitions, it's a fact that there are people from Orthodox Jewish households that are in public schools. And it's a fact that Chilul Hashem is measured by what the Tovim Shebu'umos do. And therefore, it's a tremendous Chilul Hashem and a kitrig, this whole idea. So now we have like this. We've shown in Gittin this attitude. We've shown on the draft this attitude by leading rabbis and Rosh Yeshivas. There's a civil war going on in Eretz Yisrael between various Rabbanim and Rosh Yeshivas, and gradually more and more stuff is coming out, which is why Rosh Shmuel Miller made a fundraiser, and the Lakewood Rosh Yeshivas, and Rav Eli Ber Wachbeigel, and Rav Aaron Shechter, they're aware of what's going on. And now we're showing on the morality issue right here in the good old US of A in New York City. We're showing exactly this attitude, this I don't know what this is. They want to be exclusivist or whatever it is, but it's chazad treif, and it's responsible for a lot of the problems that we're having. So now in the final few moments that we have, 6 or 7 minutes, I want to get to 801A very quickly. Now, you were involved in fighting. The original 801A type thing started when it became a law in 2002, I understand from you, but it got upgraded around 2010 or 2011. And you saw the handwriting on the wall that this was going to be used. The upgrade would apply to private schools and yeshivas as well, that you have to teach civics or whatever it is, respect, tolerance, whatever it is, for alternative lifestyles. Now, you tried to bring this to the attention of Agud, the people. What happened?
So in 2010, after the law passed, because I found out about it shortly before, and I didn't have any contact with the Agud at all. So I called up the Agud office. I spoke to I think it was the office advisor. I didn't speak to him. I spoke to the secretary, and I brought concerns over the fact that 801A, and it could eventually apply to yeshivas because it's written in a way. So I got a reassurance. They called me back and said this will not apply to yeshivas. So I said, even if it doesn't apply to yeshivas, it could apply later because the bill's not clear and there's nothing in the. Even if we could win something, which at that time we didn't even win a ruling on that. We only won a ruling by the Board of Regents years later on the subject. But they were told at this option and they dismissed it. So that's really.
I want to move back. We skipped over something. I want to make this very clear to people. Aguda did darn little, too late on the marriage situation. They went mekotza lakotza from saying, which I don't even know if they ever believed it, especially based on the documentation of what you said happened within a matter of the same day or days. With Rabbi Lefkowitz, the same day.
The articles are a few hours apart.
Okay, now listen to the point. You asked them, how come you're meeting with Cuomo? You should better spend your time trying to persuade certain legislators that you might have an influence on. And the answer is very pashut, because there is a rumor that has legs to it, that basically Cuomo was dead set on this bill passing, and that there was a deal made. If you want to have tap grants for the yeshivas, for the yeshiva colleges, tap grants, etc. There was some kind of a wink, wink, blink, blink with money, or it could be that in return for them going to Cuomo, in other words, there was an understanding there, whether it was spelled out or whether, but it's clear. The rumor is that Cuomo told them very, very, it could even be, it was told to them through this guy of his who's now sitting in prison with an Italian name, who was his he was his bully boy. He was a tough guy, and eventually he landed up for taking bribes. He's in prison. And to believe that Andrew Cuomo didn't know anything
about the carrot and the stick. The carrot was the tap, and the stick was the Markey bill, which passed this year.
Okay. So the people don't understand what you're saying. The Markey bill is the bill that now is allowing many people to come and sue the yeshivas, et cetera, because of child molestation cases that happened years and years back. There's a 1 year window, etc. So whatever the dirty deal was, but Rabbi Say, this is the way things roll. And this wasn't the first time, because with Papa Mario Cuomo, when he was running for his final re-election, he suddenly decided he wants to meet with the Motzes Gedolei Torah. And they allowed Mario Cuomo, he says, I want to honor the rabbi. So he went from his World Trade Center building, he went a few blocks away, literally, and he came to the Aguda offices so they could have the photo ops in the Jewish Observer, etc. At that time, there was all kinds of garbage going on with schmutzige advertisements on the transit authority, on the subways, the trains. Now, I asked, and I was told that they did not really push and bring this up heavily at that meeting. And it's very interesting because Cuomo, or whatever they did do, Cuomo played with them. He played footsie with them. He said, well, this is very interesting. It got professorial. I have to know if it's constitutional. The rabbis, we have to think about it. Meanwhile, that same Memorial Day weekend, in the LIRR, they were threatening, or they started to go on strike. In other words, transit authority, public transportation. Cuomo didn't wait for anything. He knew that a Memorial Day weekend, there better not be a strike when everybody wants to go wherever they're going. He shut down that strike by giving them the money they wanted so fast. So for the morality and stuff like that, he started to get all professorial and constitutional. He was playing with the rabbis. And the rabbis, the Torahs Hashem Machkimas Pesi, that makes smart, they didn't even have enough savoir faire seichel, respectfully, to say, no, we're going to come to you. So there was an additional dimension of a bribe there. Look, I'm coming to you. I'm being machabed you. You know, how could you do this? Okay, we have literally 1.5 minutes.
Bloomberg had a similar thing. He went from the gay marriage rally to the Aguda dinner on the year the marriage passed. You had the year before the marriage passed.
All right, listen, right. I remember that well. All right, we have less than a minute now for the 801A. So could you tell us anything else about it? We're going to have you back. We're going to have to have you.
When I met Yerucham Sober, I told him in Albany this past year that showing him that in the guidelines, his response was, "Why are you talking to me? I'm not a legislator." So I had to tell him, because he's a good appointment. He's a good lobbyist. If he's not aware of it, then we got a big problem on our hands.
Yeah,
he's the one who's supposed to fight.
I love Yerucham Silba. I know him since he was a bar mitzvah boy. He's a Gewaldiger Ben Torah and everything else. But I've had these conversations with him many times before, and he knows our position on this thing. And I think that what we did tonight is we established very, very clearly there has been a pattern of over a half a century of hear no evil, see no evil, sins of omission, I don't see it, and unfortunately sins of commission, shrugging the shoulders, we might as well get whatever we can get for the meisters because we're losing anyhow, and das and Jens and Tzatza Tanviduns and everything else. This goes against Hashkafa, like the Chinuch said, we are impacted on. We do know, as I said, Rabbi say it's Elul, and as I said 2 weeks ago, instead of Agudas Yisrael doing tshuva and announcing Oshamnu, Bogadnu, like Rav Aaron Soloveitchik said, or instead of saying Boishnu B'Kolam, instead of that, they continue blithely, and we'll discuss this in the coming weeks. We'll have plenty on again. There hasn't been one Orthodox politician who hasn't made many compromises and voted for Schmutz up to and including the last month or two. Until we meet again, this is Yehuda Levin wishing you a good Tamid, and you're invited again tomorrow, Friday, at 86th and 7th Avenue, I think it is, at the Diker Heights Golf Club. You're invited to the chasna of my daughter, and maybe experience only simchas. Thank you so much. A good Tamid. Okay.